Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Husain Haqqani, a senior fellow here at Hudson Institute and the director of our South Asia and Central Asia program. It's a pleasure for me today to welcome you to this event at which we will be hearing from Carlotta Gall, the Pulitzer Prize winning reporter of the New York Times who spent almost a decade in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, I have known her throughout that period, and I can say one thing, that she has been an extremely intrepid and very sort of meticulous reporter throughout that period. The book that we are discussing today is a book, The Wrong Enemy, America in Afghanistan, 2001 to 2014. And of course, you have probably read the reviews of the book, and you've also heard about some of the controversy that has been generated, especially in Pakistan, which is my home country, about this book. Of course, as a Pakistani, I share the angst of my countrymen who get very worried wherever they are, whether they are in Washington, D.C., or Manila, or Dubai, or Kuwait, and they pick up a newspaper and they feel our country is being criticized. There are Pakistanis who get very sentimental and say, you know what, we are the world's biggest victims of terrorism. The largest number of people who have been killed by terrorism are in Pakistan. Then when it comes to the relationship with the West, Pakistanis get angry over the fact that Pakistan was an ally of the United States during the Cold War. And they feel that the United States has not treated Pakistan well enough. I, by the way, have written an entire book on that subject as well, which is also available these days, in case somebody wants to buy both of them at the same time. Although Carlotta's book, The Wrong Enemy, is going to be available here, and she will, after this event, sign it for you. So going back to how Pakistanis feel, Pakistanis often get very reactive. They get very upset. They think everybody's criticizing us too much. There's more to Pakistan than just terrorism. There's more to Pakistan than the fact that bin Laden was found there. And all of those points are true. And I see several Pakistani faces in the audience, and I'm sure they all know what I'm talking about. The sentiment of Pakistanis, especially of the wonderful Pakistanis who live in the United States, who get upset over what they perceive to be criticism of Pakistan. But at the same time, it's important to see where all this criticism is coming from. The rest of the world cannot understand why Dr. A.Q. Khan, a nuclear proliferator who sold Pakistan's nuclear secrets to third countries, should not have been punished. The world does not understand why Hafiz Saeed, a known and recognized international terrorist, operates openly from Lahore and holds rallies, goes on television, and is admired as a kind of a hero. The world does not understand whether Hamid Gul and General Asad Durrani, who are former heads of ISI, and General Aslam Beg, who is a former chief of the army, when they speak in favor of bin Laden and speak admiringly of terrorists, whether those sentiments are still present in Pakistan's military or not. People to this day, almost, and I was ambassador of Pakistan at that time, I know to this day a lot of Americans are still struck by the fact that Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan in a town that is primarily a garrison town. And so, from the point of view of Pakistanis, it is an interesting question. Nobody wants Pakistan to be perceived as America's enemy. The title of Carlotta's book seems to suggest, as President Obama did, by the way, during his first election campaign, that America's interests, primary interests, were not in Afghanistan, but to the east of Afghanistan. That most of America's concerns about security emanated not from Afghanistan, but from the east of Afghanistan. And I think Carlotta, based on her reporting, has put together a very interesting narrative. Now, people can agree with it, people can disagree with it. But especially to the Pakistanis in this audience, who I'm fearful will clog the question and answers particularly, I would like to say to them that there is a poem by Robert Burns which goes something like this, that may some power the gift give us to see ourselves as others see us. And as a Pakistani, that is the reason why I am quite happy to have Carlotta Gall as our guest today. To comment on Carlotta's presentation, we have a very able Pakistani commentator, Dr. Mohammad Taqi. Dr. Taki lives in Florida. He is from Pakistan. He's a columnist in the Pakistani newspaper, the Daily Times, and also contributes to many international publications. Although he's a medical doctor, I think he also knows how to feel the pulse of Pakistan and at the same time recognize the various infections running in the veins there. So we will definitely hear from him as well. But first, Carlotta.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm now actually the New York Times North Africa correspondent. I'm based in Tunisia. So I've moved on since I've finished the book. And I came across something the other day that helped me explain why I wrote this book. I was traveling in southern Afghanistan with a young Tunisian reporter who, aged 23, took part in the revolution. So he was only 20. He was on the streets when the uprising happened and they overthrew the dictator Ben Ali. And he said to me, you know, one thing that started it all, and he said it was a WikiLeaks cable that came out a couple of years before the uprising, and if I remember the dates right, and he said it was an American diplomatic cable writing about Ben Ali and criticizing the dictator, criticizing the corruption and the way he ran the country. And he said that was an eye-opener for us. Because we suddenly realized that America didn't support this man. And suddenly there was a sort of window opened, and it made us realize that he wasn't invincible because America didn't even support him. So I think it made me think that's partly why I wrote this book. It's just to open a window and put the ideas out there. I'm just a journalist, so I'm writing what I've seen on the ground over, in fact, it's been 12 years now, reporting from Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I don't have any policy agenda, and I don't have any real ideas for the way forward, but I do want to say this is how I saw it on the ground. And I think it's very important to keep reminding us what is happening on the ground. So there were two things really that drove the book. Really to give the Afghans a voice, because when you're reporting, you see so many things happening in a war that people are the victims and they can't speak for themselves about it. So I really did want to give the Afghans a voice and show what was happening on the ground. So there's whole chapters about civilian casualties, that committed in the war, the American bombing, a wrongful arrest of detainees, some things that really shouldn't have happened that did, for various reasons of failure to understand the culture and the people, and then a strategy of continuing to pursue the enemy, the perceived enemy in Afghan villages, when in fact a lot of them were innocents. And it got me thinking, because every time you went to a bomb site or a battlefield, you came across people who said, why are the Americans fighting us here? Why are they bombing our houses? When the real cause of the problem is across the border. And of course, we all knew that after 9/11, when the American intervention overturned this Taliban government, the Taliban leaders and commanders and Al-Qaeda elements and foreign fighters all fled across the border into Pakistan. We all knew that. Everybody who was there on the ground, the journalists, the soldiers who were fighting there, the diplomats knew that too. And then, of course, they were left to their own devices, and the fighting continued in Afghanistan, but the source, the leadership, the structures that kept the insurgency going all these years was over the border in Pakistan. So that was something that just became a continual plea from the Afghans. Why is America not going to the source of the problem? And you probably all know that President Karzai would repeat that for years and become increasingly frustrated as he felt he wasn't listened to. The second reason that I wrote the book was to give voice to the Pakistani journalists, especially. Afghan journalists have been free this last decade under the Americans. You know, they have some difficulty. They do now have threats from Taliban. But it really became clear over the years that the Pakistani journalists were under extreme pressure and intimidation and control. And I came up against it personally in 2006 when I was in Quetta in Pakistan, trying to find Taliban members to interview in Quetta. I was also tracking families of suicide bombers who had died in Afghanistan in suicide bomb attacks. And we started to find out that the boys who were doing it, they're often young teenagers, were coming from Pakistan. And I wanted to find the families and see how they were getting sucked into this and why. And I was horrified to find that the families often didn't know where their sons had gone. They'd been in madrasas studying somewhere, and then they'd been taken away for training. And then the next thing they knew, they were getting a phone call to say, hold a Fatiha, your son's Shaheed, which is just mind-boggling because they had no idea it was coming. But secondly, they were terrified to talk about it. And they did, because they were Pashtun. They would often, be very hospitable, so they would let me in to their houses and they would talk, but they were frightened. And I started to see that there was something much more sinister. Every family that I visited in those few days was then visited by Pakistani intelligence officials. And we went back to one woman and she said, please go away because they've come to me and they said I should never talk to you again. So there was this climate, and I started to talk about it a bit more, and I understood from Pakistani journalist colleagues that the pressure was extreme. They often expected to get picked up. Often when they were on their own in the street or in their car, they would get bundled into a car, they would get taken away for several days, they would be held somewhere, interrogated, often beaten, often worse, strung up, sexually assaulted, threatened about their families. They'd be told, we know the route your little girl takes on the way to school, she could easily have, an accident. Some really nasty things. And then they would be released and told, stop writing what you're writing, don't work with foreign journalists often, and don't talk about this. Don't ever tell anyone where you've just been the last few days. So there was this silence about it, but gradually, of course, reporters would tell you what happened. And of course, usually they changed their ways. They stopped reporting the difficult things, the sensitive things. And I started to understand Pakistani journalists know a lot more than they're writing. And I have a line in the book that I think if they'd had freedom, Pakistani journalists would have found Mullah Omar and found Osama bin Laden way before the Americans did, because they're very capable. They're just intimidated and scared. So I hope to give some voice to some of the things that my Pakistani colleagues have told me. And some of them have urged me to report this because they feel their hands are tied. So it's in that spirit that I wrote this, not to denigrate Pakistan. It's a country I love and respect, but to give some voice to some very important issues that I think are not getting aired inside Pakistan as they should. Just briefly, because I don't want to run on, tell me if I'm running on, but I chose the wrong enemy for the reason I touched on of the Afghan villages. It's a quote from something that Richard Holbrooke said. He was the special envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan under the Obama administration until his untimely death. And he said actually to David Miliband, the British Foreign Secretary at one point, that means they were having a discussion about the Taliban, and he said that may mean that we're fighting the wrong enemy in the wrong country. In other words, all the effort, the military offensives, the surge even against Afghan Taliban in Afghan villages was tackling the symptoms of the disease when the source of the problem was across the border in the training camps, in Fatah, in the madrasas, and meeting places of the Quetta Shura in Quetta and often in Peshawar, and perhaps, I will say it, in the headquarters of the ISI, which has managed, I believe, this whole campaign very cleverly, using a proxy force in a way that's deniable, but they, as I uncovered time and again, their hands were in everything that was coming out of Pakistan through this last decade. And then finally, well, maybe I'll stop there, shall I? Or
Yeah. Feel free.
well, finally, many of you may have seen the Sunday Times magazine extracts of my book, which covers the Bin Laden safe haven, if you want. He was obviously, you all know, discovered to be living in Abbottabad in May 2011 when the American Special Operations Forces raided his house and killed him and his son and his partners. But what it opened up for us as journalists is it revealed, my God, there he was all this time, living quite a normal, if secret life in a Pakistani town. But it then opened up for me another several years of investigation as to, so who was hiding him, who knew, how did he manage to stay so well cloistered there. And in the course of my investigations, and I talk about it at length in a chapter of how safe houses work, how the ISI works managing people, how they keep the police away, they scare the journalists, they scare any questions away, so they have an ability in Pakistan society to hide someone like this in plain sight, if you were. But what I found most alarmingly at the end was an inside source that actually told me, yes, the ISI did have, the Pakistani intelligence did have a special desk, and they were actually running. They not only knew Bin Laden was there, but they placed him, they were protecting him, and they were managing him. And we can talk a bit about the motivations as to why, but I put that in there. It's a single source piece of information, but I don't put it lightly. It's come after 12 years of work. It makes sense with everything that I know. I've checked it against other people who can't necessarily confirm it, but say that makes sense. We'd worked out something similar. The American CIA people who were watching the house for nearly a year had come to the same conclusions, that there was no, for example, no back door, no tunnel, no way for Bin Laden to escape if there was a raid. And they calculated, therefore, that he was always expecting and planning to be forewarned if there was any danger. And that to them meant Pakistan, someone in Pakistan was going to tip him off if a raid was going to come down. And for that reason, they did not collaborate with Pakistan on the raid. They kept it secret, and as you all know, America did it as a unilateral action, going in without warning the Pakistani authorities. So I put out my pieces of information for you to judge yourselves. I'm not being dogmatic, but I do say that I've tried very hard to only use sources that are proven, who I really trust, who I've often worked with for years, and so I'm offering it up as this is my best effort, and I really think this is how it is. So with that, I think I'll pass on.
Thank you very much, Carlotta. Of course, there are a lot of questions that come out of it, and there's a couple that I will pose to you after Dr. Taqi has made his comment. So Dr. Mohammad Taqi.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Haqqani. Glad to be on the panel with you, Carlotta. Thank you everyone for coming. I see some Afghans and Pashtuns. Khosh Amadin, Pakhair Agle. This is important to me, Carlotta's work, because it is very personal. I don't come here as just a commentator or a columnist for Daily Times, but I grew up in Peshawar when Ayman al-Zawahiri, Abdullah Azzam, Osama bin Laden, Jalaluddin Haqqani, Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, they were all camped out in my hometown. I remember the day when Abdullah Azzam was blown up. I remember the day when Burhanuddin Bahauddin Majruh was blown up. And these were all the people who had a thoroughfare through my hometown. My hometown stands ruined, as does my home province and the larger Afghanistan. So I come to you as a witness to history. And as Carlotta has mentioned in her book, that it is, she's tried to preserve an initial first draft of history. And I would like to comment on that, if I may. She already mentioned Ambassador Holbrook's comment, and I think he was on the dot. Lord did not give him enough time to actually pursue some of that. The fight that we have seen all along in this, and I talk about the AFPAC hyphenation, and in this book, Carlotta has actually tried to stay away from the hyphenation. And as politically incorrect as it sounds, if you see the 10 provinces of Afghanistan that border Pakistan are the one where all the ruckus is. This is an area where the problem starts. This is an area which keeps the gel, it serves as a gel between the three prongs of the Afghan insurgency. This is the Viper's Pit, the North Waziristan, where the Haqqani network is based. And everyone knows that an agreement exists between the Haqqani network going back 2006, and in which there is at least a peaceful coexistence between the Pakistani security establishment and the insurgents which bomb going all the way out from here to Kabul. And this is the prong, probably the strongest and most lethal prong of the Afghan insurgency. And then you have the Quetta Shura, which you have talked about. And then up north, we keep hearing about Kunar and up further Nuristan and those areas where the Gulbuddin Hikmatyar's group is operating by and large. Again, you know, why it is only along this border? You have to ask. And as physicians, we nail the diagnosis by taking a good detailed history almost 60% of the time. So if you knew the history of what has been going on, you would be able to actually come to the conclusions there. Jalaluddin Haqqani did not come to this area after the Soviets rolled in. He actually had a camp out in Miramshah for the longest time, way before the Soviets were there. In 1979, he was chosen as the head, actually before the US involvement in the Afghanistan war, in Miramshah. He runs a madrasa, the Mamba ul Ulum, which means the fountainhead of knowledge, and the party organ is called the Fountainhead of Jihad, Mamba ul Jihad, which all came out from this region. So there is a very important reason that this hyphenation should stick and still should persist. Most of these prongs of the Afghan insurgency, they are not just Afghan, they are Pakistan-Afghan insurgents, especially the Haqqani network. So and whenever you're fighting a guerrilla warfare, basically the idea is that you have a Pakistan faucet which keeps pouring in all this into Afghanistan. You can try mopping up Afghanistan all you want, but unless the faucet has not been shut down, there is very little chance, almost futile, that there could be a success out there. So this is where Carlotta's prescriptions would come into picture, or at least the understanding of what exactly is the mother lode comes from across the Durand line, and she has shown time and again from the original rise of the Taliban, and I was in Peshawar at the time in 1994 when they scored their first victory out of the blue. You certainly had these people who were sweeping Afghanistan like a whirlwind, and then suddenly you found out that they were hooked to the telephone grid. The Kandahar was hooked to the Quetta telephone grid, Khost was hooked to the Waziristan telephone grid, and Nangarhar province was hooked to the Peshawar telephone grid. And at the time, on the eve of 2001, the Loya Pakhtia region was still hooked to the Pakistani telephone grid. The Pakistani security advisors, like, as she points out in her book, Colonel Imam, the real name being Amir Sultan Tarar, he was with Mullah Omar at the time, and so much so that even the Pakistanis were sort of flustered that what exactly was he doing there, and that's all in the book. And Musharraf had to call him back up lest he's caught there. So this is the genesis of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, 9/11, all had origins in that hapless region. So why does it matter now? Well, it does matter because there's a mindset that is pervasive, and Afghanistan is a large country. You have put in a lot of this place, this country, the US has put in tons in treasure and blood, and Afghans have put in exponential amount of that. And all of that should not be allowed to go waste just because there is a hegemon neighboring Afghanistan. What happens in Kabul will not stay in Kabul. It did not. It did not before. 1992, it did not. It spilled over not into Pakistan, but we saw that eventually here. The strands of 9/11 go all the way back to that death and destruction. Pakistan might be a suicidal state, but rest of the world, us, we don't have a death wish. And someone actually needs to instill a fear of God and come up with a treatment plan. And I don't use this slide to impugn anyone, but this is the headline from one of the Pakistani papers. Pakistan keeps close eye on vote in its Afghan backyard. Excuse me. Excuse me. You know, look at the mindset. And a liberal paper saying a country which has existed 200 years before you did, a country which was fairly at peace before you came along, a little unruly kid on the block, and basically that's where the problem lies. It is not just the Pakistani establishment, but the indoctrination that has gone through for the last 2-3 generations. This is where we are stuck with. It is not your backyard, dude. You need to get the heck out of there. Look at this. Another one. This is an opinion piece. A real nice gentleman writes a piece. Pakistan's Afghan burden? Pakistan's Afghan burden? Is that where we... So this is the level of understanding that we are dealing with in Pakistan. And that's where you can help people to understand, get an insight into what is actually going wrong in that particular region. And this is exactly what the Afghans responded with. This is the universal symbol of the independence and resilience, and the vote that Afghans gave, that was not just for democracy, plurality, it was essentially, they voted against the intruders. They came out in droves on that rainy day against all odds, against all the bomb threats and whatnot, because perhaps they wanted to elect one or the other candidates, but more importantly, they wanted to keep the other pretenders to the Kabul throne outside. They wanted to keep them out. And what they are looking for, and Carlotta mentions wisely in that book, is that it's not necessarily the US or ISAF boots on the Afghan soil that are needed, but they really do not want to be abandoned. You know, assistance, training, support, civilian, military. A country which has 50 plus television channels right now. This is Afghanistan. This is not the Afghanistan of 1992 where you had one state-owned channel. This is not something, this wheel is not turning back no matter what anyone in the region or elsewhere wants. Afghans want peace and they want progress. So how do you help them? You help them with this, but above all by stymieing the interference that comes from an unfortunate neighbor. I've used an example from the biblical terms, the story of Joseph and his brothers. Afghanan Megan ke Pakistan biradar Yusuf mast. It is just like the Joseph's brothers who threw him into the well. That's kind of the raw deal that the Afghans get at the hands of Pakistan. And there's an old Persian saying which says, "Chah kanra, chah darpesh." You know, you dig a well for me, you are going to fall in it someday. And this is exactly the blowback that the Pakistan is experiencing on that side. And one important part of the book that I wanted to highlight is the chaos policy that Pakistan has actually practiced in Afghanistan over the last 30-40 years. You know, when chaos is the only solution, this is actually being practiced as a policy. They have not known anything better, or perhaps they have not tried to look for anything better. You know, if you were to look at different scenarios that they work with, it could be a strong Pakistan-allied Afghanistan. It could be a strong anti-Pakistan Afghanistan, in their view, perceived, a weak anti-Pakistan Afghanistan, or a weak Pak-allied Afghanistan. This is what they want to settle for eventually if they can't get this. So this is where the chaos picture is coming into the picture. To keep the Afghanistan weak and even the proxies under their thumb to the extent that they control every single bit. Not just what President Karzai or his entourage may do, but even what Mullah Omar and Mullah Baradar do. And to this effect, this book documents in a series, it's a decapitation campaign that Pakistan-sponsored proxies have unleashed on Afghanistan for the longest time. No Afghan left behind, eliminated. Anyone who had tribal standing, political standing, religious standing, starting from Dr. Muhammad Najibullah, the PDPA leader, Ahmad Shah Massoud. That was the first suicide bombing that took place in Afghanistan. The two guys who actually perpetuate that, two Tunisians, get a visa from the Pakistan embassy in London, as the book mentions. They've come to Pakistan, and it's not some kind of a subtle covert operation, but they fly in a very high-profile visit to Kandahar and are received by the Taliban officials who already had their Pakistani security minders with them. This is something that could not have been lost on that. And I briefly wanted to touch about Commander Abdul Haq, who was the strongman from Nangarhar province. Abdul Haq wanted to go into Afghanistan on the eve of 2001. And the book mentions that he was unarmed. And there is a reason that Abdul Haq was unarmed. This man was wounded 17 times perhaps in the Soviet war. He knew how to use arms. He was disarmed in Peshawar before he would take off on that journey. He was not allowed to leave Peshawar with arms. He went into Bajawar. He wanted to buy arms on the open market there. Abdul Haq was not allowed to buy arms in the tribal areas, which is a common customary thing happening. Everyone else can do that, but he was not allowed. Every village that he would go to, they would either deny sanctuary to him or they would refuse arms to him. So when he ended up in Nangarhar, he was tracked by Mullah Abdul Razak, who was the interior minister. And this is the same guy, Mullah Abdul Razak, who has worked very closely with the Pakistani security agencies, and by some accounts, at least by Ambassador Peter Thompson's account, he's the one who actually shot President Najibullah inside the Afghan palace. This is the same guy. So,
okay, we have a few more minutes for you, a couple of minutes, so if you can
okay,
wind it
just
up.
real quick to, there is no difference between good or bad jihadis. They are always joined at the hip. This is Hakimullah and this is Abu Dujana, who bombed the forward base Chapman. And we'll talk about plausible deniability and everything, but I really want to ask just one question here. The case of Nasiruddin Haqqani. Everyone is asking Carlotta about her sources. In this town, the biggest story that was broken that brought a government down was one source, unnamed source, the Watergate scandal. Yes, there were questions asked, but if that had been shoved under the rug, maybe there would not have been a whole Watergate scenario. So stories cannot be ignored. Yes, double sourcing, it is important, but I want to ask the Pakistani naysayers, why could you not discover this chap in Pakistani capital? He was killed in Pakistani capital. He and his uncles stayed 5 miles from the presidential palace, from the GHQ, so on and so forth, and nobody discovered it. Either you are too lazy to go look for it, or you are too scared. And I think it is probably a little bit of both. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Now, before I open this to the audience, I'm going to ask you two both a couple of questions.
Yes.
What do you both say to the fact, not the fact, but the opinion of most Pakistanis? You're just engaging in Pakistan bashing. That this is all very fashionable, and that everybody says that Pakistan has real problems. Pakistan has done its best in fighting terrorism. Basically, its own concerns about India continue to get ignored by the rest of the world. The insurgencies inside Pakistan that are fomented from Afghan soil are ignored. And essentially, you guys are just sort of taking the easy way out by blaming Pakistan. What do both of you say to it? Quick answers from both. Carlotta, you first.
I would say, we're entitled to write what we think and we see is happening on the ground, but much more important, the what Pakistan is doing is costing lives. People are dying, tens of thousands of Afghans, tens of thousands, if we believe the figures, of Pakistanis in their own country. So every journalist has a right, and I would say a duty, to write about this, whether it's palatable or not to the audience. So that's how I see it. There's just no question that we should be looking at this if people are dying, and if countries and their futures are at stake. I'll leave it at that.
Quick reply, Dr. Taki.
Osama's body may have been drowned or it may have sunk in the ocean, but the rot and the stench is still there. Did anyone actually answer that? Pakistan itself suppressed its own inquiry report. Yes, I hear someone in this town asked Carlotta to release more sources. I demand, why not make that report public first, in which it does not rule out something more sinister than just the incompetence that the Pakistanis have been pleading. Osama found there, every major Al-Qaeda leader found there, and then in the certain area where they were. Have you guys ever pondered that Mansehra and Abbottabad region, not a single terrorist attack in that particular region over the last 10 years, whereas hundreds of attacks in Peshawar and elsewhere? Yeah. Something just does not add up.
Okay, so we have an interesting book and two interesting presentations. The book is available. By the way, those of you who are on Twitter and who are watching this online, the event is being tweeted live with the hashtag #TheWrongEnemy. And I hope that some of you will get the book and get Carlotta to sign it. As I said in my opening remarks, the purpose of this event is to try and open up a discussion. And I am quite happy to take questions from the audience to try and open up the discussion further. My own 2 cents worth is that whether we believe Carlotta's account, which I believe is based on sources that she has cultivated for many, many years, or we question it, either way, the questions she raises deserve answers. And those answers will determine how the rest of the world will interact with Pakistan, especially, and how it will see Afghanistan. And ironically, it's not just Carlotta. There are others who are asking similar questions. The Canadian Minister for Immigration last week went very far when he said that Pakistan should be considered a state sponsor of terrorism. It's not the first time. If you read the accounts, historic accounts, you will find that that question has been around for a long time. As a Pakistani, that worries me. And I wish that those at the helm in my country would actually try to answer the questions that people like Carlotta Gall have raised, so that we do not come to a point where the hostility towards us totally supersedes any explanations that we can offer to people. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are open for discussion. Mr. Zeitlin, why don't you take the first question?
Thank you.
Right here at in the first row.
Should I wait for a microphone?
Yep.
Yes. It's always useful to wait for a microphone now.
Yes, you're right. Is it on, though?
It is.
Okay, fine. My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and I opened up the first Associated Press bureau in Pakistan in 1969, when things were not so different than they were today. 2 questions, really. One, in view of the light security that surrounded Osama bin Laden in 2011, I've always thought that basically by then he was a marginal figure in Al-Qaeda, and that in fact the United States may have done Al-Qaeda a favor by getting rid of him. That's the first. The second is with the US and NATO drawdown in Afghanistan, and with the likelihood of having a very weak and divisive president succeeding Karzai, what sort of scenario do you believe will occur in so much as the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan will become even more fuzzy?
Great questions. Interestingly, I was just in Kabul. I'm going to answer the second question first. I was in Kabul last week, just before the election, and met someone very close to Dr. Abdullah, who's one of the front runners in the presidential campaign. And he pointed out, I said, oh, Pakistan will be very angry if a former Northern Alliance close aide of Ahmed Shah Massoud, becomes president. And he said, on the contrary, Abdullah is on record as saying he will recognize the Durand Line. And he thinks that that will solve a great deal to solving relations with Pakistan. He's also a former foreign minister, and he strongly believes in improving relations with Pakistan. That I thought was very interesting. I don't know how it'll play out. I don't know how the election will play out. Ashraf Ghani is the other front runner, and I'm not sure what his stance is. He's a Pashtun. I think it's very difficult. You can talk to this professor of whether any Pashtun could actually recognize the Durand Line, because that's a big issue for Pashtuns, and I think that's why Karzai could never do it. But I think the drawdown doesn't have to be a disaster. I think everyone's weary of the troops. I think it really does, though, depend on how Pakistan reacts towards the new president of Afghanistan, and I think the ball is in the court of Pakistan. Going to your first question, I think bin Laden, even though he was cloistered, even though we hadn't heard directly from him for a long time, I think he was still an incredibly important figurehead for Al-Qaeda. I think he was being used by Pakistan partly for those reasons, to use his influence on other militant groups, whether Pakistani or foreign, who were at large in the region. And I think I think also there was possibly the way to hide him and put him in protective custody, as it were, in a safe house in Abbottabad was also because Pakistan did not want to be the traitor that gave up this Arab Mujahid leader, however much he was criticized by some, he was revered by many, and I think the Pakistani leaders thought better to hide him away than to have to hand him over or to be responsible for his betrayal and death.
If you wanted to hide in Pakistan, would you go to Abbottabad?
I think I would. Lovely town, beautiful.
Great Chinese restaurant.
Yeah, beautiful weather, and he had a great view as well, which of course we British love, you know. Can
I quickly just make one point about the Durand Line? No matter what Dr. Abdullah thinks, there's a long history and a long controversy about the Durand Line. I've written about it in the recent past. What I call the Pakistani federally administered tribal areas, it is actually the federally abandoned tribal areas. What we really need to have is a good open discussion about the Durand Line, and something along the lines where China and Taiwan actually do work together despite having certain issues, certain revanchist, irredentist issues. And some of you probably do remember the West Germany and East Germany. West Germany actually had a new Ost policy. And Afghanistan probably has to have something along the lines of a new Ost policy, where actually the problem is not shoved under the rug, it is recognized, but still the relations are maintained to the extent that the irritants are removed, border trades are happening, people are going back and forth, and I think the Pashtun nationalists on the Pakistani side, they may be open to something along those lines.
Yeah, although I must say that, just for the record, that Dr. Abdullah is not the only Afghan who recognizes the Durand Line. Afghanistan legally recognizes the Pakistan-Afghanistan border as the Pakistan-Afghan border. And so it is legally actually an international border that both countries recognize and have recognized at least since 1948.
May I
No.
clarify, because I'm not talking about the Durand Line.
Right, I brought that up.
The fact that the Pakistani Taliban will have free access to a safe haven in Afghanistan in much the same way that the Afghan Taliban have free access to safe haven in Pakistan.
Dr. Ullman.
An observation and then a question, and the question I'd also like Ambassador Haqqani to answer, please. Logically, it seems to me more than implausible that if any Pakistani official of seniority, such as General Kiani or General Pasha, knew about bin Laden's whereabouts, they would have turned him in because they would have gotten a blank check from us that was worth the earth. And Ambassador Haqqani's book, which talks about the Pakistanis believing that the Americans needed them more than we needed than they needed us would seem to support that. So it seems to me that if anybody of standing knew, they would have had the earth in exchange for bin Laden. My question is this. In many ways, both Afghanistan and Pakistan are ticking time bombs. The withdrawal is going to go badly. Afghanistan is dependent upon lots of money, which is probably not going to be there, as well as a very, very strong advisory and stay-behind force, which is probably not going to be there either. And Pakistan has got so many ticking time bombs from 80 million kids who don't have jobs, madrasa train, an administration that's even more incompetent than the last, all sorts of economic problems. I wondered if you could both speculate on how you see the future a year from now, 2 years from now in both countries, because it seems to me that none of those major problems have been addressed or are likely to be addressed.
I'm just the moderator, so I'll let Carlotta answer.
I've learned the longer you stay covering places like this, the more you learn not to predict, especially with Afghanistan. And a great AP reporter, Kathy Gannon, says she never predicts anymore on Afghanistan because she's always wrong. Although, so I don't know, but I fear that things could become very difficult for Afghanistan for those reasons. With the military drawdown, you'll see a reduction of aid. You'll see a reduction of attention and diplomatic pressure, all of which Afghanistan needs to survive. The great worry is if they can't pay their soldiers and their police anymore, you will then start to have, people drifting off, forming militias, and you will lose that in fledgling state institutions that they do have now, and I hope they can hold that together. As for Pakistan, I'm very, very worried. The latest reporting that I had in the last year of writing the book, and some of the stuff since, is that the militant groups, whether they're Punjabi or TTP in the border areas, are dead set on a return to the battlefield after 2014 drawdown of foreign troops. So and I went to the Haqqani madrasa just last year, and the people I met there said, inshallah we'll have the white flag of the Taliban flying in Kabul again. It sounds crazy, but some of them think and believe that they're certainly going to make a dead set at trying something, and that's very worrying for everyone. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, quickly address this. Yes, Pakistan could have been offered heaven and earth, but their insecurities come from a presumed parity against India, and I don't think that the US was actually putting up that offer, even if Osama was given. And some of this jihadism actually is deeply entrenched in that paranoia against India. I don't think that it was that simple as handing over Osama bin Laden and actually getting a blank check.
Yes, sir, right at the back.
Samar Chatterjee from Safe Foundation. I would have to say that I think, Ms. Gall, you made a very interesting point, and I think the CIA and United States government should have known that even at the time George Bush made the decision to invade Afghanistan. Given that it's not just Pakistan's guilt, today's Pakistan, which was once part of India, where I was born, and so the Pakistanis should have looked at things the same way as we do, is cast by United States. Pakistan's intelligence agencies have been trained by United States. So given that those behaviors are very similar to what we have in the United States. So United States is as much guilty for having invaded Afghanistan. So your concept that wrong enemy, the United States did want to pick a wrong enemy. Would you comment on that?
A mistake of choice.
Yeah, or of necessity. I think it's very true that America made many mistakes, and I think one of them is not to know its enemy. It's the first key thing: know your enemy more, and it's one of the reasons why we as journalists always argue we should go and interview Taliban leaders. If I could, I would interview bin Laden, even though that might shock people, because you have to understand your enemy and you have to know them. And I think I am sometimes mystified by Americans who who, as you say, have had this long relationship with the ISI, why don't they know them better? One counterintelligence official said to me, yes, but the problem was when you're collaborating with, in other words, with the CIA, collaborating with the ISI as partners, it means you don't spy on them, or you don't suspect them, and you don't watch what they're up to. I find that slightly odd because, you know, for years I worked in Russia, and that was my first training at university, and I lived in Moscow as a reporter for 5 years, and there, so I'm used to seeing that, the American KGB, you know, system of watching each other and studying each other. And I always wonder, why didn't we have that same sophistication between the CIA and the ISI? And I think, I think it was because there was good collaboration on that level, and there are people who wanted to continue that. And still today, you do find in the administration, in government, there are the people who support keeping the relationship good, and slightly ignoring the other things that are going wrong. And I find that hard to understand, and I think it's a failing on the American side. I think you're right.
I think, by the way, that applies both ways. There are people in Pakistan who want to see the United States as an enemy, but the Pakistani establishment does not want that to happen. And similarly, there are people in the United States who want to see Pakistan as an enemy, and there are people who say, why add to the list of enemies? Why not try and work around and maybe see each other as bad friends or bad former friends, rather than look at each other as enemies? And I think there is some merit to that argument in the context of the bigger picture of international relations. Right in the front, and then I'll take, okay, so I'll come to others.
Hi, David Isby. Read your book, very good, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'd just like to say, after you say not to know your enemy is your first mistake, makes me regret even more that there is no one good book in English on Pakistan intelligence and security. No, you wouldn't imagine it in 1944. There were lots of books on the Luftwaffe, but we do not have a good book in the ISI and its friends in English. But
Well, except for professors.
well,
Very
it's
good
not a
book.
history of the institution. It deals.
I see. Right.
And of course, what we're seeing in Afghanistan is only, the U.S. Strategic Air Command used to have a motto:
Right.
"Peace is our profession. We only kill people as a sidelight." For the ISI, their profession is inside Pakistan and countering India as their profession. What we see in Afghanistan is a direct continuance of those two.
Right, yeah.
So, with that in mind, if you were to be prescriptive, what would you recommend with dealing with Pakistan? In Kabul, there's no shortage of people who say, given the sanctions against Iran or a naval blockade of Karachi, maximalist approaches are easy. Yes, in Kabul, obviously, that's probably not what would you recommend?
And by the way, keep the microphone in this area because I intend to give the floor right after him.
I usually say to this that I'm just a journalist, and I'm not a policymaker, and I don't know what you would do. But one thing I do believe, and which is why I read the book, is put it out there, because I do feel there are a lot of people, when I talk to congressmen here, who don't know things that I, having lived there, feel is obvious and everyone should know. And it shows I get a bit too stuck into my subject, but I am shocked sometimes at the lack of knowledge, even among people, congressmen, other journalists who aren't specialists, but don't quite understand the depth of things. And then on the Pakistan side, I think there's an awful lot of Pakistani civilian, ordinary people who don't know the half of what their government is doing. And so my feeling is, as I started with the WikiLeaks cable, we must have more information out there. And I would like to see American officials talking more frankly about this. On the level, perhaps not of Chris Alexander the other day saying they merited sanctions for terrorism, but for sponsoring terrorism, but at least much more frankness about what we know is going on, and and what Pakistan is up to. If it was laid out clearer, I think it would be much easier with authority instead of with, just a journalist trying to find sources with difficulty. I think that would call a spade, made things much, much easier to tackle. And eventually, I see the way forward as the civilian government in Pakistan seizing back control of foreign policy and security policy and saying enough. We're going to redirect our efforts in different ways and redirect our finances and the budget. I think that's the way, and you'll only get that with people power, with people understanding what's at stake and what the country needs. It's a long shot.
Well, an important thing in the book, of course, is Carlotta's own personal experience of being intimidated and physically hurt in the process of reporting. I don't know how many people remember and recall Salim Shahzad, the journalist who was killed, and we've never heard about him ever since. Nowhere do we talk about him, etc. So I think that the answer to your question as to why there is not a good book is that intelligence services that have an intimidation arm as well make it very difficult to write about them. I'm sure that there, and a good book is difficult to come by for that reason. They have their reasons. They have their. They think they're protecting Pakistan, and some of us who are Pakistanis, as Pakistani as these people are, we think no, they are harming Pakistan by being the way they are. But they don't want that debate in Pakistan. And then when foreigners talk about it, it only feeds the paranoia and the xenophobia that outsiders are trying to hurt our country. The lady right behind.
Thank you. Mehreen Farouk from the World Organization for Resource Development Education. I wanted to thank you, Ambassador Haqqani, for putting together a very thought-provoking discussion today. The organization that I work with, we recently conducted some research along 70 cities in the region, both in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, looking at civil society initiatives for peace building. And what we really found is that despite all the politics that are being played out in this region, that the people of both countries are longing and are working towards peace and stability. My question, Carlotta, is I have not had an opportunity to read your book, and I really do look forward to it. But I was wondering if your book sort of went beyond the Durand line to look at how both countries are being played as proxies by other states. As most of us in this room are probably quite familiar, for the past 30 years, there's been extensive foreign funding of extremist institutions in this region. If you just even consider 2 months ago, the major attack that took place in Kunar province really highlighted how some of this foreign funding has come directly from the Gulf states. So I was wondering whether your book sort of looked at these factors as well.
Thank you. I mean, I do look at it. One of the things that I found incredibly difficult to do is to track funding. I'm just a journalist. I don't have access to government systems of monitoring that, and I found very difficult interviewing people to get details on that. But it's partly because I'm also not in Washington, where a lot of it, I think, is. I'm always in the field. So I regret there's not enough on that, because I think you're right, the financing is incredibly important, and then being able to track who. I've never been able to get to the bottom of who in the Gulf is supporting these groups. You always hear, oh, private institutions, the states are not doing it anymore, but somehow all this money's coming, whether by briefcase, by hawala. I learnt in places like Kohat, there's big amounts coming into the banks there, and the banks just don't ask questions because they're happy to have funds. But I still don't understand what institutions or what private individuals are paying the money. So I think there's a whole other book there, and it was just too difficult for me to go that step.
We're also getting questions on Twitter, and I think they're being emailed to us as well, so I'll put some of them in as well. I will let Dr. Taki make a comment on some of the questions that have been asked, and then I'm going to ask 2 or 3 of you to lay out your questions so that we can have answers together to try and save time and give more people an opportunity to ask questions and make comments. Taki,
two comments. One was about the prescriptions. You have to have a diagnosis first. As simple as that. It's a don't ask, don't tell policy unless you actually recognize the problem, that whether it's a frenemy or enemy or some sort of a problem ally, you would not be able to come up with prescriptions, and not necessarily punitive actions. Pakistan has a jihadi drug habit. I say they are hooked on jihad. So to wean them off is not going to be easy. The least you can do is stop rewarding them for bad behavior. That's the minimum that can happen. The second part, I wanted to address this question of the financing that is coming through. The gentleman that I talked about, Nasruddin Haqqani, he's one of the Haqqani sons. He lived in Islamabad in open 5-6 miles outside. He was their main money man, traveling back and forth, most likely on Pakistani passports, going to Dubai, where one of the Arab wives of this Jalaluddin Haqqani lives. And they were setting up camps at the pilgrimage time where people would come into their tents and donate money. So there's a lot of black economy money that is going on. They have set up their own taxation in Miramshah area. So essentially a parallel government is being run there, and it's not unknown.
Okay, 2 or 3 questions. Young man here, in the middle, and then on the right. And then we'll come to you, Mr. Boggs, in a second.
Hello, thank you. Brandon Mendoza, former USAID contractor in Afghanistan. My question is also following along the discussions of the Durand line, which is that it seems to me, and you guys touched on this earlier, which is that we know for a long time the Pakistani government has supported the Pashtun nationalists who, of course, do not recognize the Durand line. And I'm just curious as to, is there logic that keeping the state weak, even if it means that they do not recognize the Durand line, in the long run they feel is the right strategy? I've always questioned why they aren't more aligned openly with the Northern Alliance, going to what you said earlier. And then a second question was, the consensus here in Washington always seems to be, when we talk about not rewarding Pakistan for bad behavior, which is that if the United States were to suddenly cut off aid or military cooperation as it did following the development of the nuclear weapons, we would have this gulf and we would no longer be able to talk to each other. And that seems to be the consensus, is that what's happened in the early 90s. And I wonder, how could it possibly be any worse than it is? So I wonder if you all could comment on that issue.
Second question, right to the gentleman right next to you. Right.
Yeah, Joseph Lacandi with the King's College in New York City. Thank you, Ms. Gall, for your book and for your reporting there in the region. This is an uninformed question, so bear with me. I don't understand why it is that the Pakistani security forces, the police, on the one hand, as we're told, they are battling terrorists in their own country. They're battling the Taliban and other radical forces, and they're dying in the process. Yeah. But then, according to your account and other accounts, they're helping the Taliban and their friends there in Afghanistan. It seems such a self-defeating strategy. Is there some ideological or religious reason to explain that? I just don't understand how you can be helping and killing. Just help me out there if you could.
Welcome to the club. And I'm a Pakistani.
Hi, Ken Meyercourt, World Docs. I'm of the school that believes that Osama bin Laden died in the Tora Bora Mountains of Afghanistan in 2001 and not in a compound in Abbottabad in 2011. So I was intrigued by your information that the Pakistanis had been monitoring his presence in Abbottabad. I wonder if you could clarify what your source on that was and how much faith you put in that information. And in this regard, could I ask, have you tried to interview the wives?
Are we done
Yeah,
yet?
go ahead. So 3 questions
I would
together.
love to interview the wives, but no. They unfortunately were taken immediately into ISI custody, and no one got to see them at all except ISI and I think some American officials eventually. And now they've all returned to Saudi Arabia, and I haven't tried to go and see them there. But you're right, there's a great tale there to be told. I have several sightings in the book, particularly one militant commander who told me he saw bin Laden twice. Once after 9/11, but he'd met him before, so he recognized him, he greeted him. I think that was in about 2003 in the mountains of North Waziristan. So I believe he survived Tora Bora, but that you knew that already. the most interesting question is why, why Pakistan in some places fighting the militants and dying. I mean, we know military and police are dying. Their headquarters are getting attacked. They're being ambushed. There was one time even when they have to take their, well, I think still now, they have to take their uniform off if they want to go downtown in Peshawar, the military, because they're targets in their own country. And yet, they, as I show, are supporting these militant groups and are cooperating with them. And as the complaint is often from Westerners, their level of meetings is so high level and so detailed that it's more than just information gathering in order to, for intelligence. It's actually cooperation. They have some of these leaders in Camp Hamza, which is the ISI headquarters that runs the Afghan desk in Rawalpindi. These men come, people like Nasiruddin Haqqani would visit ISI headquarters. So the level of collaboration with these militant leaders is very high. So what is going on? My feeling is some of the, and I show this a bit in the book, some of the militant, these proxy groups have always been fostered by the ISI. They have always been used and controlled. And sometimes some of them get out of control. And then either they're slapped down, assassinated. I'd love to have a chat about who killed Nasiruddin Haqqani, because I suspect it was the Pakistani secret services or possibly the Americans. I don't know. But so sometimes they slap them down or they control, and sometimes they arrest them and they torture them. And one of the most militant leaders, Ilyas Kashmiri, who's been behind a lot of these attacks inside Pakistan, he was taken in by the ISI with his father, according to my sources, and tortured in the same room, both of them naked, which you can imagine is a horrendous thing for anyone, but particularly for Muslims. And he became so angry that then he turned against his former handlers. And he had been a special forces, highly trained, operative. And so, of course, he was a deadly enemy when he turned against the state. So that was an effort to control him, to make him obey, and it actually backfired. So I think you've got a lot of that. And then you've got Al-Qaeda really meddling and causing problems. We know Al-Qaeda attacked Musharraf, even twice nearly killed him, even at the time when I show that Musharraf was saying we must be allowed to continue our support of our proxy militant groups. So it's been a mixed bag, and what I try and show is that what's been fatal is Pakistan's trying to play both sides, because you just cannot do that because of this cross-fertilization, because of the danger of people turning against you. You can't meddle in that way with something so dangerous.
Dr. Taqi, I would like you to take the young man's question about the Durand Line and how, the sentiment of Pashtun nationalism on both sides, etc.
Sure. The mainstream Pashtun nationalist parties in Pakistan, there's two, Pashtunkhwa Milli Awami Party and Awami National Party, who participate in the parliamentary elections, and de facto they accept the two-state solution for the Pashtun issue. And they're in Pakistani parliament, but off the record, a lot of them do not believe that the Durand Line is the permanent border, and they do seek a permanent solution, more durable solution, even if it is a token acknowledgement that when I was a kid growing up, crossing the Turkham border, Mr. Jinnah's quotation was right up top. It said, the people living on each side of this border are one people, and no power in the world can divide them. And that was taken down during the Zia era. So there's a lot to be discussed, but as I said earlier on, a policy has to be made where you actually do not allow the Durand Line to create what is called shatter zones, where these bad groups and unruly groups survive. And I think Pakistan uses that as a policy to create these shatter zones. And just to segue into that question, why they keep doing it, cost of doing business. This is the overheads that Pakistan incurs in terms of doing this. As Professor Barney Rubin had once said, ISI is only loyal to the ISI. and that's their old modus operandi. You had Kashmiri militants, they got out of hand, they created another batch. Remember the Afghan Mujahideen, they wanted to keep them divided into 7 groups, they got out of hand. You had Taliban getting out of hand, you have good Taliban. So, that goes back to that chaos theory. To solve a chaotic problem, they come up with a bigger chaos.
Okay, last round of questions, and then I'll have one final question, and we'll try and then give Carlotta an opportunity to sign books for you and give all of you an opportunity to buy and really read the book. The gentleman right here in the front, then right behind him. And then one more questioner. If somebody is really anxious to ask a question, raise your hand now. Okay, so we'll come to that.
You're first.
Make your questions brief, please. We're trying to save some time.
Yes, I'll be very brief on 2 observations and a quick question. First observation, the ISI is a military organization. Its culture is very different from the CIA or the KGB. Its culture is more similar to the GRU in the old Soviet Union. Second observation, the Iron Amir himself, Abdur Rahman.
You didn't introduce yourself, sir.
Would you introduce me? I'm Rajesh Kedi, and I've done some writing, and I happen to be a friend of Husain's as well. The second, Sheikh Abdur Rahman, the Iron Amir himself, said that the Durand Line was not permanent. It would depend upon the Afghan people. So all along, its permanency has been in question. My question, of course, being from India, is how is India impacted post 2015 by the AFPAC region? Thank you.
Pass the mic behind you, and we'll come to these 3 questions.
Yes, okay. Carlotta, you were in...
Introduction first.
Tony Drexler, international health consultant. I spent about 8 years in Pakistan, late 90s, and then again early 2000s, and spent some time in Afghanistan. And my question really is, you spent 12 years there, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if you'd speak a little bit about the Islamization of Pakistan that you observed, and particularly perhaps the growth of the Afghan Taliban and the increasing, absorption of some of that ethic into Pakistan society, which did not really exist when I was there. And then secondly, when I was there, I was observing the separation between the ISI and the military, and the compartmentalization, where the ISI perhaps being, the military being at least partially a modernizing force, and then gradually moving towards a more Islamic thrust.
The gentleman right in the middle.
My name is Badr Sen Vikram, and my parents were refugees from Pakistan to India. My question is, what role, in your opinion, can the new Indian government play in a constructive manner
That's
going
basically
forward?
the same question as Mr. Kadian, right? And then the final 2 questions from Bob Boggs right there, and Ms. Faranaz Isfahani right here.
I'm Robert Boggs from the Near East South Asia Center, and you may have answered this question in your book, but so forgive me. I think there's plenty of evidence, I'm speaking of the ISI, that various divisions within ISI follow different, have different policy goals and are sometimes at loggerheads with one another. So they're not coordinated horizontally. Do you think that same segmentation could occur vertically, such that the kinds of cooperation we all know occurred at the local level between ISI agents and local jihadis might not actually be fully reported up the line, so that someone like, a ISI chief could honestly say that he doesn't really know everything that's going on? We've seen that same phenomenon elsewhere, including the United States.
And the last question, the young lady right here.
My question for Ambassador Haqqani and Carlotta Gall and Dr. Taki is this. One of the things that one always noticed in Pakistan, firstly, I want to correct. We've been talking about Pakistan all along today. We're actually talking about the Pakistan military and the ISI, which has de facto taken over the state of Pakistan because of very weak civilian governments. My question is this. Sitting here in Washington, why throughout this time that we're talking about, when American diplomats, government officials, and generals would go to Islamabad, they would always go and see the head of the ISI first and the army chief first, and then come and see the president and the prime minister. So don't you think that on one hand, they have these troops in Afghanistan, they're pouring in aid, the war on terror, the hunt for bin Laden, but on the other hand, they help keep the civilian governments weak? So that's my question. Do you agree with what I'm saying?
Okay. So this is your opportunity, both Carlotta and Dr. Taki, for final comments. And Carlotta, remember the pitch you make right now is going to make people buy the book.
They're quite disparate questions, aren't they? Are there any
Yes,
that
they
you want
are.
to jump
Just try
in
and
on?
kind of connect them. Two of them are about India. Do you think?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on India, so but I do know that the bit that India has been helping Afghanistan, both on humanitarian assistance, which I think is key. That they feed, for example, they give all the the nutritious biscuits to school children through the whole country. Vital to keep that going. They're also offering military aid and training, and that, of course, I think is problematic. And I think I would beg that India be very wise in its efforts to help Afghanistan. Of course it wants to help, and of course it wants good relations, but you must think of how that goes down in Pakistan and the backlash. So India's building of a road from Gardes to Host, which is right up to the Pakistani border, was just really unwise, and it was USAID that gave the contract, which was also stupid. and the Afghan government actually didn't want it, but they didn't have a say because it was a deal between the Indian government and USAID. That was just unnecessary. And just a red rag to Pakistan. So I would ask for some definitely continued assistance and support, but judicious decision making. The Islamization of Pakistan is just something that unbelievably sad that I've seen, because as a young student I traveled around as a backpacker over a lot of Pakistan and had a wonderful time and always really fantastic reception. And then I went to one of the same areas again in Malakand as a reporter with a friend, and we went to see a cleric from TNSM, which is one of these groups, and he, although he said yes, when we got there he refused to see me as a woman, and I wasn't allowed even into the compound because he had a house but a madrasa all part of the same compound. So I had to sit in the car outside, and my journalist colleague went in with it and took a tape recorder. And the driver, we actually had two cars, so the drivers got hungry and went off to the bazaar to get some nice chapli kebab. So I was sitting reading in the car, and the boys came out of the madrasa, and they were all, I would say they were 10, 12, 13. And they saw this foreign woman sitting in the car, and it was really quite scary. They all crammed around the car, and they rocked it to the point that I thought it was nearly going to turn over. And I just thought, never before would have Pakistani boys behaved like that. And they obviously saw me as a sort of demon, and it was only when someone came around the corner that, I was about to climb into the front seat and start the car, but it was actually very, very aggressive, and they were young teenagers. So that's the level of, and so what do you think? What are they being taught in the madrasa that they behave like that? So that's my little story on that.
Farah's question about U.S. policy.
Yeah. Which was what, to keep
that American policy enhances and strengthens the ISI's role in Pakistan's domestic politics and the militaries rather than enabling Pakistan to find its own pluralist way forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the worst thing has been the funding, especially under the Bush administration, that just went into the pot and was so lavishly given to the military in order to do operations in the border areas, but was just, just a carte blanche for the military and to get stronger and stronger, and the civilian government didn't. But I do think it's difficult when the administration officials come over to Pakistan and they have a list of things they want done, and they should of course go to the civilian government first. They should insist on the protocol being correct, but they typically, with Americans this happens, they want to get stuff done, so they go to the man who they think can call the shots and get things done. So
which is usually the army chief.
Army chief, yeah. And it's very unfortunate, obviously, with Musharraf, it was the same person, so they got used to that, and then I think they just continued. But I think that was a big mistake, to keep going to Kiani and believing they could change his mind, and actually not really boosting the democratic government.
Dr. Taki, final comments, responses?
Sure. Quick dovetailing into the same. Basically, you get what you pay for. You keep dealing with the same people over and over again, taking the easy route out. Politics is difficult. Negotiations are difficult. Diplomacy is the art of making things possible. Military solutions, on the other hand, are zero-sum solutions that the Pakistani military establishment has had for Afghanistan. And one thing I would be remiss not to mention is the army establishment actually existing almost like a rentier state, living off of the money that they get from other places. $1.5 billion received into Pakistani coffers from Saudi Arabia, no questions asked, on a personal guarantee. Where is that money going, and what kind of curriculum is actually that buying? And that may help explain some of the Islamism that we see on the streets of Rawalpindi and Islamabad. These are changed cities. I grew up in Peshawar in the 1970s. It used to be a pretty laid-back city, and you could get around on a bike without any problem. Women too, and that is not something which is possible now. So people have to think long and hard whether it is the easy way that we have to take out or not. I really want to thank Carlotta for actually putting together the case for the Afghan people, the victims who have suffered through this all over the last 30, 40 years. I remember the day the first Afghan Muhajir actually pitched a tent right in our backyard in Peshawar. So it is really with a warm heart that I thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let me just wind up the discussion. As a Pakistani, addressing especially those Pakistanis who are in the audience and who are watching this on the live webcast, we as Pakistanis, of course, always get disturbed when others say things that we see as critical of our country. But there are certain facts we should always recall. In 1947, what is today Pakistan had a literacy rate of 16%. What is today India had a literacy rate of 18%. Today India's literacy rate is 75%. Ours is hovering around 55%. 42% of our school-going age children do not go to school. Our spending on education is 1.2% of GDP. Compare that with, say, for example, 10% of GDP in South Korea. We now have the lowest school enrollment in our region. Bangladesh, which came out of Pakistan, has a 90% plus school enrollment. India, out of which Pakistan came out, also has a 90% plus enrollment rate. Something is definitely wrong. We have made some wrong decisions. And as a Pakistani, even if when I do not agree with Dr. Taqi or Carlotta or others on specifics, I do agree with one thing. When somebody else tells you your house is on fire, it's always a good idea to pay some attention to that. Thank you all very much. And now for the book signing.